special interviews, highlights, and live broadcasts from ICT's annual international conference.
Here we are in the middle of the campus at IDC International Radio 106.2 on your FM dial. I'm Dan Diker, and I'm pleased to be sitting opposite Lieutenant Colonel and Reserve Avital Leibovich, who was one of the senior officers in the Strategic Communications Division of the IDF. And she's an expert in what I would call the soft war, the fourth generation warfare. We might be able to call it fourth generation counterterrorism today. Lieutenant Colonel Leibovich, what do you think? The soft war seems to be as important, without a doubt, as the hard war on the ground.
Hi, Dan. Thank you for having me today in this show. Well, actually, I don't think the terminology soft really describes the current situation. I think we're more looking at a rough era of media where sometimes the boundaries are crossed, the red lines are lost, and I think there's a lot of extremism going on. Take, for instance, the coverage of terror, because we are here in the International Conference on Counterterrorism. I think that the media sometimes is selective about which terror to cover. Is the Syrian terror a good place to be covered, or we have seen enough in the past 3 years? They haven't really covered it in the first 2 years until the two journalists were killed, the French journalist and the other European journalists, and we didn't hear anything about it. Is the fact that a rocket on average of, I don't know, a few weeks here lands in Israel is a good enough reason to cover it or not? I'm afraid not. This is not a news item anymore. So I think the media war is something that we must pay a lot of attention to. It has trends, it's changing, and what we have seen in the past is no longer relevant.
Avital, you have been on television hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds.
I would say thousands.
Even so, I was being conservative.
But who's counting?
But who's counting? Exactly. And you and I actually have crossed paths a number of times in the International Television Building on Jaffa Street here. You were in uniform at the time. I mean, we're not talking about that long ago, but you were in uniform and in front of millions of people around the world. What was the most difficult challenge for you as a spokesperson, as a media professional in the IDF system when facing the international media in wartime, and not to mention routine everyday challenges?
I would say that the main challenge when appearing on live TV interviews was to maintain my calm in relevance to the very naive questions I was being asked. And obviously, the anchors many times, especially in Al Jazeera and other TV news channels, try to make me lose my temper, which I did never give them the chance to see me lose it. And but the level of the questions really show a very scary phenomenon. The anchors don't really have a clue what they're talking about. I mean, it's very easy to sit in your studio in London or in Paris or in Rome and then discuss something which you have never seen with your own eyes. Never seen even once with your own eyes. This is why it's so critical to bring those influentials here to Israel. Now, let me tell you another challenge that I had in routine times. Most of the foreign journalists, by the way, we have here around 800 of them.
More than anywhere in the world besides the United States in Washington. Yeah.
Right. And this is, of course, really a riddle because nothing has been going on for years and years. And by the way, when there is an operation or the Pope is visiting of something of this magnitude, usually the number triples, doubles or triples. Most of them are located in Jerusalem. But do you think they're located in Jerusalem because this is the Israeli capital? No, the reason they're located in Jerusalem because they are here to cover the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's 10 minutes drive and it's very convenient. Now, my challenge was to try and make them see other parts of Israel, whether it's in the southern border, the northern border, maybe just an Air Force base, just to show and explain the challenges that these pilots have when they're fighting this urban warfare. This was a huge challenge to make them, God forbid, go into the car and drive for an hour to one of the sites I wanted them to see. This was very, very difficult.
Well, they're not interested. What happens frequently in international media is that they all follow one another. They look over the left shoulder. What's she doing? They look over the right shoulder. What's my friend at this network or that network doing? And they just do the same. It's really, I called it Lemming news. The lemmings are the little rodents that follow each other, and they do. They just follow each other right off the cliff.
And also, they follow the wires.
Yeah.
And the
right.
wires are very nicely
AP,
spread.
Reuters.
Right, but they spread very geographically wide. I mean, they're spread in Gaza, in the West Bank, and sometimes the stories that come from there get a major spot. Headlines or front pages in the website and so on. And once again, it's from a very narrow perspective of that reporter in Gaza, of that reporter in the West Bank. So many times we are giving the opportunity to comment. But between you and me, who goes all the way down to the end of the article to read the final comment, the other side commenting? You usually read the headline in a few, 3, 4 lines. That's it. In the very fast world that we live in today, you don't have the time to read an entire article. This is, by the way, why many times in websites, in news websites especially, near the headline, you will see the reading time in parentheses, so in order to urge the readers to read, but still it doesn't work.
Clearly, reading time is an issue. The larger issue also is the integrity of reporting during wartime. You know, unfortunately, we're living in a period in which the enemies that Israel fights, such as Hamas, for example, have been legitimized by many international news organizations and international players much more than in the past. One example, it has never happened before that the President of the United States has offered to broker a truce publicly, stated publicly, between Israel and its arch enemy, the local Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. But here you have it, that they have the trappings of international legitimacy. And so on the one hand, Israel is sort of compared, it's Israel and the Hamas, as if they're two states fighting one another. Does the legitimacy of terror groups such as Hezbollah, which in Europe is divided into two, and Hamas, which is
also divided, the military wing and the political wing, which we both know that it's the same organization.
So what kind of a challenge does that add to the role of having to be a convincing face and spokesperson for Israel in times of war?
I'll answer with an example. In the Operation Cast Lead, December 2008, which a bit went over to 2009, I remember it was Saturday night. I got a phone call from many journalists who were sure that Israeli soldiers were kidnapped and murdered. And the story was as follows. The Hamas issued a formal announcement in which they declared they kidnapped 9 Israeli soldiers and killed them. Now, everybody thought this was an official announcement, right? Because they did not know to differentiate between a terror organization, a political wing, or something else, or just a political party.
And propaganda.
Right. And they believed it. So I had a very short time to stop the snowball from going on. So I went from one studio to another, and I killed the story. And I remember, speaking of naivete, I remember the anchors asking me, "Are you officially denying that Hamas kidnapped IDF soldiers?" And I said, of course, it's not only am I denying, I'm indicating that this is a blunt lie, and I'll tell you, we'll see more of those coming on our way. And you should be aware of that. So this is just an example to show you, but you asked me about the coverage, and I want to say a few words about that. I think that the last operation last summer, in 2014, Protective Edge, marked a new era in lack of professionalism in the media world. We saw time after time journalists that were afraid to report what they saw, because you can count the number of footage items that you have seen of firing rockets from within the streets near the hotels. Now let me tell you something, a huge revelation. There are 3 hotels in Gaza on the beach, and all the journalists are in those hotels. Namely, if one journalist looked outside the window and saw a rocket being fired from the street, then all the other journalists in the building should have seen the same thing. But yet only few reported. They were afraid.
Meaning they were afraid of the repercussions by their Hamas minders if to their reporting what they saw.
Exactly. And not only that, a lot of portion of the footage and the material, the stills pictures, were actually freed only when they left Gaza. And they returned to safety to Israel, God forbid, but they return to safety in their perspective. So this is something which is we need to shed light on.
Well, how do you deal with that? Now you're the Director General of the American Jewish Committee, their headquarters here in Jerusalem, and you were for many years as an official in the strategic communications post at the IDF. How important is it? You see it from both sides, from the official side and from the unofficial side. How important is the coordination or certainly cooperation between Israel and non-government organizations who are friendly, want to help Israel, and as a pluralistic Jewish nation state? How important is the cooperation?
First, I think there's a gap between the way media is presenting Israel and the governments, the government-to-government cooperation. There is a huge gap. If you only watch the news, you could get very quickly very much depressed. But there are good cooperations between the governments. And also, as an NGO, I believe that, we learn whatever the government presents on different topics. It's not that we are exactly saying the same thing as the government, but we do have an opportunity as an NGO to try and help position Israel's place in the world in a better way, to advocate Israel in a better way. Now, one of the things that we do is we bring groups of people from all over the world. I can tell you that in 2014, we had here people from 26 countries, diplomats, journalists, people from the academic world, deans, university presidents, and so on, as well as some business people. And we are not trying to make some kind of propaganda. We're not trying to convert them into Zionism, but we are trying to break their perceptions, the same perceptions that the media is such a huge part of. So we will often take them to the northern border. And when you stand on the Bental mountain and you hear the noises of explosions, but then you look down and you see the red roofs of the communities, the Israeli communities, then you begin to get it. And when you go to Kibbutz Nachal Oz on the border with Gaza, and then you speak to the people that live there, which, by the way, they're not on the right political side of the map, not at all. They're there to work. They have plantations, they have tourism, and then they begin to get it. And when they meet an Ethiopian, and they meet an Arab Israeli who is a doctor, a woman or man, doesn't matter. And then when they meet different sectors in the Orthodox community, they understand that this is a more complicated issue than the very shallow information they've been fed on for many, many years through the media.
I've always had this question, actually, I use this opportunity to ask it. What can Israel do better in the whole area of spokespersonship? It's a tactical question, because the strategic question I'm going to ask you in another moment, and you and I actually just co-chaired, I must say, a very lively session here at the International Institute of Counterterrorism's 15th annual summit on counterterrorism, and we took the BDS terrorism, anti-Semitism workshop. And so there's a strategic question there, but here's the tactical issue. What could Israel do from your many years, and you can speak now, you're not in uniform, what could they do better in order to try to shift the tide against the naive questioning, against the negative press coverage of Israel?
I think that the price tag that the different ministries have on producing high-quality products as part of campaigning for Israel is something that needs to be looked again. I know that the budget that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, has is similar to a budget for producing one commercial. And this doesn't make sense at all, especially not in the era that we are facing and the challenges that we are facing. This has to be looked and special attention should be devoted to this. So obviously you need the funding for it, and it's not sufficient. The current situation is far from being sufficient. I believe that at the IDF we try to interact with as many audiences as possible. And sometimes I see this in the government, that there's a lot of focus on Europe and North America, but we are forgetting many other countries. What about the Balkans? What about Latin America? What about Africa? We saw what happened. 5 Latin American countries left their ambassadors, left their posts here a year ago. Maybe we haven't invested enough in those countries, and these are the consequences. So I think that we do need to widen our audiences, not go for the expected, think outside of the box, which is something which is very, very difficult to do within frameworks of governments. And I do think that students in universities are a huge tool for operation. And we should utilize this. Just like here in IDC, Students are very active in war times and operation times, and it's really admirable in 80 languages and so on. We need to do the same on an everyday basis.
You know, I think that's extending the reach for hearts and minds. That's your message, and I think a very excellent suggestion that you made in the workshop, and you repeated again here, I think is something that those students and educators here at IDC ought to think about very carefully. We had a very well-respected war room in wartime, but as you say, every day, even though we call it in Hebrew shigra, we call it the routine times, would be the time to put those students to work and
then we are in a warfare. We're in a media warfare, and we can win this war. We must win this war, and we have to do it ourselves.
There you have it. I think you said it the best. We're just going to end it right there. Lieutenant Colonel Avital Leibovich, the Executive Director of American Jewish Committee here in Israel, and former senior officer in the IDF spokesman's office. Thank you so much for joining us on IDC International Radio 106.2. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.